I was on my third cup of terrible station coffee when the signal came in. Kethora Station was not a beautiful place. It smelled like recycled air and engine grease, and the lights in the docking lounge flickered every 11 minutes because nobody had fixed the power relay in 6 years. I had been sitting there for 4 hours waiting on a clearance stamp for my cargo manifest, a load of agricultural processors bound for a farming colony 2 systems over. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous, just another quiet run on a quiet route. The kind of job that paid my fuel costs and kept my ship, the Persephone, breathing. Then the emergency channel crackled to life on my wrist comm, and everything changed. The voice on the broadcast was a Vrethian distress operator, speaking in the flat, controlled tone of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. A colony transport called the Sorrow of Moons had suffered a catastrophic drive failure near the Dulhari debris field, one of the most dangerous navigation zones in the outer shuttle corridor. The ship had struck a mass shadow during the failure, breaching its hull in the cargo section. Life support was holding in the main cabin, but the power core had cracked on impact. The biostasis pods were losing power. Without a stable energy source, the pods would fail completely within 6 hours. Inside those pods were 42 Vrethian children, larval stage young, small and fragile, and entirely dependent on the pods to survive. I set down my coffee and listened very carefully. The Dulhari debris field was the problem. It was full of unpredictable mass shadows and rotating wreckage. But the worst part was the electromagnetic interference it generated. That interference was strong enough to destroy an AI navigation computer within minutes of entry. Every modern ship ran on AI navigation, which meant that every modern ship in range had a very good technical reason to stay exactly where it was. I watched 11 ships decline the rescue relay over the next 20 minutes. 2 Vrethian military frigates were too far out, 14 hours away, at minimum. A consortium medical vessel refused because the field would permanently ruin their nav AI and their insurance did not cover it. A station rescue tender was too small to be rated for debris field entry. 3 independent haulers simply went quiet. Then the Vrethian Emergency Authority issued a formal statement. All 42 children aboard the Sorrow of Moons were officially classified as lost in transit. The declaration meant that legally, procedurally, bureaucratically, those children were already dead. The paperwork for the families had already begun. I read the statement twice. I thought about it for 11 seconds. Then I got up, threw away my coffee, and walked back to my ship. My co-pilot, Dox, was under the rear landing strut with a wrench when I came through the cargo bay. He was a Charathi, tall, reptilian, with amber eyes that missed nothing, and a personality that was equal parts loyalty and pure stubbornness. He had been flying with me for 9 years. He knew what my walk looked like when I had already made up my mind about something. He crawled out from under the strut and stared at me. "No," he said. "I haven't said anything." "You have the face," he said. "I know the face. Whatever it is, no." I told him about the signal. I told him about the 42 pods. I told him about the debris field and the interference and the 6-hour window. He listened to all of it with the expression of a person watching a rock slide happen in slow motion and being unable to stop it. Then he told me every reason this plan was going to get us both killed. He was thorough. He covered the nav AI issue, the structural unknown of the damaged ship, the fact that Vrethian law did not recognize human salvage rights, the biological sensitivity of larval pods, and the very real possibility that the Persephone would be torn apart by a debris impact before we ever found the Sorrow of Moons. He finished by pointing out that we would receive no payment, no formal recognition, and possibly a fine for unauthorized entry into a Vrethian vessel. He was right about all of it. "I'm not asking you to come," I said. He picked up his wrench, put it in his belt, and walked up the boarding ramp without another word. That was the thing about Dox. He always came. Here is what the other ships did not know about the Persephone. She was old. She had been built for military freight under the United Earth Confederacy's early expansion contracts, back when human engineers did not fully trust AI navigation, and insisted on building manual override systems into every vessel. Those systems were considered primitive by galactic standards. Elegant species like the Vrethians had moved past manual flight generations ago. Their ships sang with computation, beautiful, precise, perfectly optimized. But the Dulhari field would kill a singing ship. It would not kill mine. I had learned to fly in a tin transport over Europa. in conditions where the computers froze and the instructor stood behind me and said, very calmly, "Feel the ship. The ship is a body. You are the brain. Feel it." I had spent 15 years learning debris fields, how they moved, how they breathed, how the mass shadows shifted in patterns that a careful human eye could learn to read. It was slow knowledge, imprecise, not elegant at all. It was enough. We entered the Dulhari field at reduced thrust. The nav computer lasted 90 seconds before the interference burned it out, exactly as predicted. I had already written down the star bearings on a physical notepad. Docs looked at the notepad, then looked at me, and said nothing. We flew on instruments, gravitational readings, and the rhythm I had built up in my hands from years of doing exactly this kind of thing in worse places. The field was violent. Chunks of rock and dead metal rotated slowly in every direction, and the electromagnetic interference made every sensor reading slightly wrong in a slightly different way each time. I trusted my instruments about 60%, my eyes about 30%, and the remaining 10% came from something that I cannot name, some quiet feeling in the base of my spine that told me when something was wrong 2 seconds before the instruments confirmed it. We nearly collided with a piece of wreckage the size of a house. I banked hard, and we cleared it with room to spare. Docs was monitoring the pod signals from the Sorrow of Moons, tracking which pods were still active. He read the numbers to me quietly. 38, 37, 36. Every number that dropped was a child I had never met and would never know. I pushed the throttle a little harder. We found the Sorrow of Moons pressed against a slowly rotating asteroid fragment. One side of her hull folded inward like a crushed can. The cargo section was open to space, but the pod bay was intact, barely, held together by the kind of structural luck that engineers pray for and cannot design. The 9 adult Vrethians aboard were alive, conscious, and when they saw a human vessel docking without authorization, one of them began broadcasting immediately. "Human vessel, you are in violation of Vrethian sovereign transit space. Withdraw immediately." The voice was female, steady, and absolutely furious. This was Vessel Keeper Thressoa. She was the senior caretaker aboard the Sorrow of Moons, and she had spent the last hour watching children die, while the galaxy decided the math was not in their favor. I answered her through the open channel. "Ma'am, with respect, I am not leaving. Please tell me which pods are failing fastest." There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds. Then she told me. The problem, when Docs and I got aboard and assessed it, was elegant in how terrible it was. Vrethian biostasis pods were networked through a biological relay mesh that shared power evenly across all units. The mesh was failing because the ship's cracked power core could no longer supply stable energy. Fluctuations in the power flow were triggering the pod's emergency protocols, which were designed to shut down rather than subject a larva to irregular conditions. It was a safety feature that was actively killing children. What I had aboard the Persephone was a secondary power trunk, originally designed to run military field hospitals in combat conditions. It was not elegant. It was not precise. It delivered power the way a river delivers water, abundantly, stubbornly, without sophistication. Vrethian engineers would have called it barbaric. The two systems were considered technically incompatible. I hardwired it directly into the relay mesh anyway. It worked. Not cleanly, not gracefully, but it worked, and the pod readings stabilized across all remaining units simultaneously, and for a moment, everyone in that damaged cargo bay, human, Charathi, and Vrethian alike, stopped moving and just breathed. Then we started moving the pods. The cargo bay had a secondary collapse risk that meant we could not leave them where they were. Docs and I transferred 42 pods by hand, one at a time, through a corridor that had partially buckled, while Thressoa and her crew worked alongside us. Nobody talked much. There was no time for talking. There was only the weight of each pod, the careful grip, the slow walk, the gentle placement. Midway through the transfer, I stopped at one pod that was dimmer than the others. Its readings were fluctuating again, a loose coupling in the connection I had made. I pressed my palm flat against the biological membrane and held the power link steady with my other hand, while Docs worked behind me to reroute the cable. I held that position for 4 minutes. My arm ached. I did not move. The membrane pulsed twice against my palm, faint, slow, alive. I held on. When the last pod was loaded and all 9 adults were aboard the Persephone, I sealed the cargo bay, walked to the cockpit, sat down, and looked at Docs. He looked back at me. Neither of us said anything. I started the engine sequence. Flying out was harder than flying in. The Persephone was not designed to carry this load, and her handling was sluggish in a way that required constant small corrections. Thressoa stood at the cockpit threshold the entire time, watching me work. I was aware of her watching. I did not perform for her. I just flew. A mass shadow shifted without warning, a large debris fragment that our compromised sensors had not tracked correctly. Impact was 9 seconds away. I made a decision that caused every Vrethian aboard to grab the nearest solid surface. I cut thrust completely. The Persephone went dark, drifting on momentum alone, silent as a stone, and the fragment passed through the space where we would have been if I had tried to maneuver. Then I reignited the engines on the far side, and we continued. An automated system would have overcorrected. I did not. We cleared the Dulhari field 11 minutes later. The Galnet signal came back. I filed my position report in one sentence. Persephone to Kethora control. 42 pods, 9 adults, all alive. Request dock clearance. Also, my nav computer is dead again. By the time we docked at Kethora station, the news had already broken across the Galnet feeds. The docking bay was crowded in a way it had never been when I left. Vrethian military vessels had arrived. The frigates that were 14 hours out when the children were declared dead, moving fast now that there was something other than loss to respond to. Senior officers in full ceremonial dress came aboard. They expected, I think, to find a human with demands, salvage rights, compensation, some kind of political leverage built from a very courageous act. They found me in the engine bay, fixing my nav computer, covered in grease, holding a cup of the station's terrible coffee that someone had been kind enough to bring aboard. Thressoa spoke to the senior officers for a long time, in Vrethian, while I worked. I did not understand the words, but I watched the officer's posture change as she spoke. Slowly, the way a person's posture changes when they are being told something they did not expect and cannot argue with. One officer approached me. Through his translation device, he asked me one question. Why? You knew there was no payment, no treaty obligation, no legal protection. Why did you enter the field? I thought about it honestly, because it was an honest question. 42 kids were going to die because nobody wanted to scratch their paint in a debris field, I said. I did not like the math. Thressoa stepped forward then. She spoke formally, in a tone that carried the weight of something old and serious. The translation came a moment later. She was invoking a Vrethian concept called Velthan, a life debt that crossed species boundaries, ancient and almost never used for someone outside Vrethian kind. She was placing it on record, in front of officers, as a formal declaration. I nodded once. I went back to my engine. Later, alone in the cockpit with the stars moving slowly past the viewport, I thought about the pod, the one that had pulsed against my palm. I had looked up what Vrethian larvae carry with them through metamorphosis, a kind of cellular memory, biological impressions of the conditions they experienced in stasis. Warmth, stability, presence. One of those 42 children would grow up carrying, somewhere in the deep architecture of their memory, the warmth of a human hand pressed against their pod in the dark of a debris field. They would not know whose hand it was. They would not know the name of the ship, or the route, or the broken nav computer, or the terrible station coffee that started all of it. But they would carry it. And somewhere in the quiet of the Persephone's cockpit, heading toward a new manifest, and another quiet run, on another quiet route, I found that more than enough. I always carried cargo that did not look back. This time, I think something will.